Marty. Really excited to be here. And thanks again, Marty, for having me. So this is Shuo. I run a venture fund called IOVC based in Silicon Valley. And I also teach on the faculty at UC Berkeley's College of Engineering. So really excited to be here. Prior to this, I spent a number of years at Goldman Sachs where covering gaming, podcasting, et cetera, was very much part of my job. So really excited to talk more about this with our awesome panel of speakers. So maybe to start, today we have Marvin, William, Mark, and Marwan with us to discuss alternative venture capital strategies, including gaming, podcasts, and others. Maybe we could ask by asking each of our panelists to do a brief self-introduction, because in our prep call in advance, they had some wonderful stories to share. So maybe, Bill, I could ask you to start.
You got it. Hi, everybody. I'm William Corbin. I go by Bill, William, Boo, you name it. Any name, I'll answer. I've been in digital business for 25 plus years. As I was telling them earlier, I was the founding member of CBS Interactive, having pitched the idea of them to build a website, and actually got to do that. And that launched me in a career of really my passion, which is staying on the cutting edge, or at least learning about the cutting edge and understanding how it works and how I can apply it to my life and other people's lives to make their lives easier and make a little money. So that's me.
Wonderful. Welcome, Bill. And Mark, I would definitely have you introduce yourself next, because you have such a wonderful story.
Well, thank you. I was in the auto industry for many years and one of the founders of AutoNation, where I was employee number one over there. We grew the company from 250 million to 20 billion in 3 years. A lot of acquisitions, a lot of growth. Over the years, then I spent some time in charter school education and built 57 schools in 7 states and had over 22,000 students and a couple thousand educators. And that was my give back period. Since that, I founded a digital marketing agency, and also I founded Esportz Entertainment Corp, which people know us as Esportz with a Z, ESPORTZ network. And very briefly, Esportz Network is Reuters' worldwide partner for esports news reporting. We upload to Reuters Connect, which allows over 3,000 news organizations and over 1 billion people a day reach to grab stories that we publish. We publish across several other publications as well. We publish with the largest betting publication in the world, Sigma out of Malta, and Medium and others. So we have a very active news business. We have over 90 freelance reporters around the world, so we're probably one of the largest. We also have multiple podcasts. We have the Esports Minute, the Esports Network podcast, and the College Quick Take. The first two are usually 1 and 2 on Google. We distribute those on about 24 platforms across podcasts on a global basis. And we do a good deal of programming. So we just finished up the first season of 26 episodes of the Gamer Hour with some of the most influential sports and celebrities who also have big passions for gaming. And we're about to launch into a new program, which is a Game House Mansion, which will be a reality show with live streaming, a lot of interaction with Twitch. We'll talk a little later, but we're also rolling up with one, potentially 2 other pretty impressive game companies, and on a path to go public later this year. So lots going on in the industry.
Such an exciting time. So perfect timing that our topic is scheduled for today. Also, Marvin, awesome to have you here. Not sure if you remember, I think we last connected back in 2017 or 2018 when you were still at 500. So would be great if you could share your story with everyone too.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. It's nice to see you again. Hi, everyone. So my name is Marvin, normally based in San Francisco. So been out in Bay Area now 21, 22 years. So I did the startup stuff, e-commerce company, didn't succeed. Then I was at Yahoo for about 10.5 years. So I've been in digital media, ran a lot of the international businesses, angel investor for a bit after I left Yahoo. Then I joined 500, started their San Francisco office, ran their core accelerator program, was a VC for about 6 years, invested in over 414 pre-seed and seed stage startups. And then I left 500 in 2019. And last year, just been managing my own portfolio. And I joined a bunch of boards, joined a bunch of investment committees of different VC funds around the world. But I think pertinent to this conversation, I'm a partner and board member for a gaming holding company called GameGroove Capital. And what these guys do are, it's a weird beast. And so we have like 4 studios that are basically rolled up under the entity. We have 2 SaaS related, gaming related SaaS companies in the business, as well as a bunch of IP. And it's a holding company of just a lot of various assets. And we're a little bit of a weird beast because, I'm in the process right now of actually fundraising and spinning off 1 or 2 of the studios, while we're also sort of like investing off the balance sheet for sort of like new potential studios. So we kind of sit on both sides of the fence on the gaming side. And we run games all the way from like big console, like AAA sort of shooter games at the sort of like big sort of like stage of lots of investment, to a bunch of mobile studios, which, in the hyper casual mid-core space. So just like it's a random mixture of gaming assets.
Awesome.
Wonderful. So I know we're just waiting for Marwan to join, so we'll be sure to ask him for his intro as well when he's here. But in the meantime, given we're tasked to talk about alternative venture capital strategies, maybe we could start there. But I think each of you have such a different perspective that I think we can dig a little bit more into, whether it's more specifically into digital media and the transformation from a more traditional media space, or really digging into some of Mark's work currently around the digital, the esports space, as well as Marvin's work on the investing side. We could start with your thoughts on how capital, particularly venture capital, has seen interesting alternative strategies within the realm of gaming and podcasting. Maybe I would ask Mark to start. We were starting to have this conversation in our prep panel earlier.
Well, and I think Marvin would be excellent to answer this question as well. Marvin's knee deep in it. I think what we're seeing, one of the things that's really helpful in our organization is because we're a major news organization for the industry and we report on the top games and the top activities, we're in a wonderful position because we've got over 90 reporters bringing us stories every day. We have many Corp companies that are developing new business opportunities, new games, this and that are all pouring their information into us. So we're probably one of the most knowledgeable and connected groups in the industry because we are part of the press. We're also part of the White House press due to our Reuters relationship, which I get spammed from the White House every single day with every single move that the president and vice president and first lady make out there. But I think really what we're seeing, and we're actually a part of now, is this roll up of companies that have some traction and revenues and opportunities and have put together some valuable assets and really to now take advantage of the capital markets. And the biggest opportunity, some of the biggest opportunities are frankly in the Toronto exchanges in Canada for companies that are not quite NASDAQ size yet, but as a pre-step to NASDAQ. So I think there's a multi-step opportunity here. We tend to be really concerned about overheads. So we have a tendency to be much more interested in letting the programming that we decide to do, whether it's the Game House reality show or a celebrity pro match with Blizzard games, we prefer, that could be a virtual set. We prefer to stay away from heavy assets like studios and so on, because they tend to be very expensive to run and operate. And I think they have, in many cases, really been an over expenditure for some of the people that are trying to build these companies, and they're a bit strangled by the amount of overhead that's out there. So I think there's an interest in organizations that can bring value, that are what I would call overhead light and more revenue driven. And I think that's where investment is going. That's where we're going. We believe that's got the best opportunity for things. But there's lots of different plays out there. The one thing I can tell you is that, in our view, we love news and entertainment. They've been around forever. They're going to be around forever. News is not a big money-making business, frankly, but it's an important business because you're knowledgeable of the industry and what's going on. So I'll start with that.
So definitely agree with you, Mark. There's a lot of exciting activity, particularly out of Toronto. So it's a great time to be going public as well and be able to leverage that capital to get into new areas and do all sorts of interesting things. Marvin, would love to hear your thoughts and response on this topic as well.
It's been super interesting because I think when you look at gaming as a whole, just amount of money that has actually come into the gaming space just in the last year, I think there's due to several reasons, right? I think most of a big part of the world is in lockdown, so that happened. The second thing, which is like a lot of the time shift of, if you look at media overall, right? Gaming is, I would argue, probably the biggest sort of like media consumption time for a lot of people, both young and old. That has been a huge shift, and I think there was a for me, I think the biggest shift is that, prior to 2019, 2020, where like gaming was starting to become, it was already a very, very big space, but within the culture, the zeitgeist was very negative on gaming, where it's like, oh, you're wasting time gaming. And I think it became like the zeitgeist became a lot more accepted last year, where like how many folks played like, just like that was the only thing you had to do, right, when you're in lockdown. So just like it became a lot more acceptable overall. And so that drove like the amount of money, like SPACs that happened last year. I think when you sort of saw just the overall revenue spikes of a lot of the big gaming companies just last year alone, that woke up a lot of people. And I think also a lot of VCs actually ended up, a lot of generalist VCs actually end up jumping back into the gaming space after leaving it about 8 to 10 years ago. And so confluence of just sort of a lot of gaming companies became very, very big, made a lot of money, started actually consolidating the space. You saw the SPAC movement of actually taking gaming companies public as well too. There were a bunch last year, and all these things sort of have driven this craziness, for better or for worse, and valuations are nuts right now too. So I've been talking to a bunch of VC friends of mine, and they're like, yeah, like we're seeing a lot of pre-seed stuff at like 15, 20 mil valuations, like pre-launch. And I mean, that's crazy, like for gaming, right? Like just like it's nuts. And so it's been fascinating, but I do worry it's a little bit bullish, and there's been a lot of consolidation. So, one of the, bunch of these players, a lot of the gaming guys are buying a lot of companies now. So for example, Embracer bought like 13 or 14 companies that we know of like last year, which is just like crazy. So anyway, that's sort of what I see.
Cool.
I think it's absolutely spot on in that entertainment and all sorts of content in the digital space just took off last year. And obviously it's come very far, Bill, from your very early days of booting up the internet and demoing how that works. So love to hear your thoughts too.
Yeah, and I'm because I've been working on a very interesting project with a VC. Actually, it's a family office that's heavily in one VC, and they brought me in during the COVID because they actually wanted to take a step back, and I thought they did something really interesting that could be very applicable here. They said because digital, all these digital content media companies, et cetera, from gaming to podcasts to even Bitcoin. To some extent, the valuations are incredible. And a lot of the standard metrics that people evaluate these companies don't exist. And so these people brought me in because they said, we want to build a framework for how we look at these. And the one metric that we could actually pull out was share of time. And I don't mean I mean share of the person's time, not what they're forced to do during their work, but their leisure time and how they spend their time. I think there's this stat like Facebook gets 52 minutes a day of people's time. Definitely supported by their valuation. And you think back when you were a kid, how you used to, one phone in a house, people used to compete to use the phone. It was that share of time. And so what we've done is we built this whole framework for them to look at the share of time people are getting across these various platforms. During the pandemic, gaming has just garnered a tremendous amount of time within a specific age group. But if you look at the amount of time, and could be 4, 5, 6 hours a day spent on some of these games within certain age groups, the valuations are there. It's a good bet. And I'm not talking about drilling down to the individual company. I'm taking an overlook at the categories. Podcasting, we're seeing people, from 2 years ago, the average person listened to 5 podcasts a week. Now they're listening to 8 podcasts a week. The average podcast listener listens to 80% of the podcast. These people are spending a tremendous amount of time engaged with this content. You look at blogs; those are like 5 minutes today. It's like, okay, maybe don't look at that category as much, but it really is building a framework of how you assess categories based on a consistent metric across everything, because there are no consistent metrics. The revenue's never going to be there early on. If it is, bet big. If you find a gaming company that's printing tons of money, go for it. Podcasting, it's a little different. You're not going to find any printing money. And also, one of the other criteria we looked at is, you look at gaming, it's $100 billion. It's big. To get into the gaming, it costs a ton. You look at podcasting, it's maybe going to get $1 billion this year. It's tiny in comparison, but to produce a podcast costs nothing. And the barrier of entry is very, very small. So, that really the perspective I'm going on right now is trying to assess, how do you assess all of these opportunities in a world where none of the traditional metrics even exist? And the best one that we came up with really is total size of the space and the amount of time people are spending individually on those platforms.
I just wanted to follow on real quick with a comment on William's notes there. Given that we've run these podcasts for a couple of years now, and we have literally probably 800 or so episodes, I wish I could say it doesn't cost anything to produce them. We have expensive talent that does this and does it professionally. So there is a cost. We're farmers. We invest. We like the space. It's important to provide information out there on a regular basis, which podcasts do. And I think, to William's point, there's more listening because people are multitasking a great deal more now. They turn on a podcast and they do something else. And so they're listening to the podcast while they're typing or working. And that is much more what's going on. In the gaming world, I really believe that gaming is the new social media. Because when I look at many young gamers, first of all, particularly younger children, they're multitasking. They're on multiple screens, multiple action elements, and they're not only gaming, but they're having their socialization and they're chatting. Where when you look at Facebook, for example, it's you post something and then you wait till somebody comes back and posts something, and it's a kind of a flat experience. It's not interactive. Whereas when you're playing Fortnite together and you're with your buddies and you're chatting, that's the socialization piece that actually COVID accelerated, but it's there and it's not going to go away. And the more tools that we see that allow people to carry on these conversations, casual conversations, while they're doing other things, whether it's gaming or other things, I think that's going to continue to accelerate that. And the valuations of organizations that can do that, we've seen that, in a couple of different areas. Discord, for example, $10 billion valuation, good example. Actually, Twitch, some of the biggest traffic they have is just conversation. So there's a whole new socialization element that gaming is sort of underpinning for people, and that's the part where it's not going away. It's not like the CBD marijuana rush where people dumped a lot of money. Regulation put the brakes on a lot of it. They couldn't go as fast. We don't have any regulation. There is no regulation in gaming. It's all creativity. So,
and I to echo that, I have a 12-year-old daughter, and her telephone, chat, Snapchat, WhatsApp, everything is all in one thing, and it's called Roblox. I will say, "Oh, how'd you talk to your cousin?" She's like, "Oh, we were in Roblox talking for 2 hours." And Mark is so right. If you've played Among Us or have kids that do Among Us or Roblox, it is everything. It's their entire communication platform and entertainment all in one. It's their TV.
Yeah. I have an 11-year-old daughter, and yeah, it's Discord, Roblox, and it's just like, that's actually how she kept in touch with her friends, right, during the lockdown.
Yep, totally. It was 100% how my daughter maintained relationships beyond Zoom was through those games.
I kind of just interrupt here for 1 second because you're actually touching on something that's really interesting to me, which is that I know somebody who's in his 20s, ex-military, no college degree, but he goes onto these gaming sites and he is like the leader of groups of hundreds, right? Comes up with strategies, determines how they're going to win, and he wins all the time, right? He's like, I don't know what level he is on Fortnite, but he's pretty high. So, you know, is there any way, do you see that there at some point in time, because as you see, you know, gamification is becoming pervasive everywhere in terms of software. Do you perceive at some point in time that people, companies who are hiring, et cetera, will look at people who are in doing well in gaming and say, maybe these guys have leadership skills that we need, or we should be measuring their success as leaders and figuring out a way to translate that to the corporation? I mean, do you see any of that? Because as you said, it's phenomenal the amount of team building and friendship and communications that are built there. And it seems like some of these guys who are leaders in gaming actually have some social skills that could be applicable to the outside world. Any thoughts?
I am looking always for people to hire now that have game theory in their background. Game theory, even designing a car, I think game theory makes it better.
You know, Marty, you make a tremendous point. There are so many STEM skills that are needed to be an expert gamer. But in addition, one of the things that I have a son who's a little bit older than, he's in his 30s, but some of his friends create swarms for investing. And obviously we've seen what can happen when some of these swarms, like what happened in Robinhood and so on, get onto a particular stock. This is this group of people that are connected on a global basis that game together and socialize on the web and decide to go after a particular company and start investing in it. So there's a lot of different angles this can go.
And they know how to act as a group, right? They've already been for hundreds of hours, and now it's easy to do the next thing.
Yep.
Exactly.
And I would also add that one of the most interesting companies I've seen, boy, I wish I might try to get into this deal, but it's a company called Synthesis. So I don't know if it's like synthesis.is, and they're one of the fastest growing ed tech companies. So it was spun out of SpaceX, I believe, which actually they had like gamification in education. And it's like the tests that are coming out of like kids are like beating like 20 somethings, young 11, 12-year-olds are kicking the crap out of like 20 somethings from it, just from the thinking perspective, right? And frameworks and whatnot. And so a huge fan, which is like, gaming is bleeding into everything, for better or for worse.
I'm really glad that you brought that up, Marvin, because I was about to follow up and say that this concept of gaming is so relevant for the world of education, but education's prevalent as now we think about learning or us being individuals that are participating in lifelong learning. So whether you're really young and at the very beginning, or even if you're years into your professional career or decades in, it could be elements of edutainment, so to speak, that could play a huge impact. And I was going to follow up and ask you about this concept of work as play or work as learning and vice versa. So love to hear a little bit more about how you've seen, obviously Marvin shared an example, but any other examples that you've come across that you thought that were super effective for gaming bleeding into other things that can be more impactful for the world of how we work, especially when things go back to normal, hopefully later this year.
Well, I can offer just it's a little bit different kind of example, but it's an interesting one. When I was in the charter school business, we built about 22 at-risk dropout high school. We had about 16,000 students, and we took kids that the education system thought that were uneducatable. And the reality was no one is uneducatable. It's a process that was broken, not the kids. And we put them in a computer-based scenario. Which is interesting about a computer-based scenario, if you will, is that it has unlimited patience, and it can present the problem to you in multiple different ways, where in a classroom situation, it's presented generally in one way, and you get it or you don't. Whereas a computer-generated education model can be flexible, dynamic. It's also complementary. It can say, great job, reward you. And it can take you ways. We graduated over 8,000 kids just in the few years I was working with a state recognized diploma and not a GED, because these were kids that were left to accomplish the credit requirements at their level, their pace. And they became in control of their education. And I think so some of the things that I see that gamification and and how technology can work together are really exciting for a tremendous number of kids who don't function well in a traditional classroom model, but are really smart. So I think that's where there's a tremendous future.
Yep. I could add I have a bunch of case studies and examples, but the best I think is how gamification, or specifically the competition element in apps, has just exploded some of these apps and is used as such a good motivator that I hope to see more of it in education, and I hope to see more of it in the corporate place. And what I mean is the tracking, like there's Strava or Peloton. It is competing against this larger crowd, and it's casual competition. You're competing against yourself as well as other people. And that type of gamification, I think, is creating a lot of stickiness to some digital products and building the sense of community, which I think is really important for these things to have long-term stickiness. We're going to see a lot of one and dones, but I think gamification is really good at holding people. And I also love it just because it's about time people have realized that we can make things fun.
Well, there's one other thing I want to mention about the gamification. I think it's extremely important with respect to education. First of all, there's virtually every college in the United States has now some type of a gaming program, whether competitive or club, because they realize they're not going to recruit students if they don't have it. The US military has it because they want kids who are all over the world to be able to connect with their family and friends. So there's so many overall benefits to bringing gamification into education that really allow for the personalization, but also this competitive nature that William brought up. I think it's a great point. The Peloton really got it right in that regard, and people love that. And I think we are going to see more of that type of gaming. The gaming centers that allow kids to get together. I think with COVID, when we get that more under control, we'll start to come back. And we'll see a little bit more of that. I don't think the average gamer wants to be just completely isolated all the time. So I think there will be ways in which schools and education can compete in that. But there's an enormous amount of activity going on across college campuses to build these relationships and skills. And the last point I want to make is one of the reasons I think it's so powerful as well is games don't know your race, your age, your skin color, your country you're from. So it is a complete level playing field, whereas traditional sports require people to have certain physical characteristics quite often. And so it's an inclusive thing, and inclusion means we're going to have more prosperity in this than we are going to have in many other models. Just my thought.
I love your point on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and leveraging technology to do that. Oh, Marty, did you have something to say, please?
Thank you. Right. Okay. So I'll give you a real world example. I love playing board games, and so I was at a group meeting of my family, and so there was we were playing a board game between 4 people. So 3 of the people between them had about 12 college degrees, and there was one guy who had no college degree, and it was a game on arguing legal things, right? And you had to determine who was going to win the game, who was going to have the right argument, what the jury would decide. And so we got crushed by the guy with no college degree, who had no, because he had common sense. And so, there's a book written by an FBI profiler. It's called Never Split the Difference. And so he has for years run, so he went over to Harvard and he crushed everybody in their negotiating, who taught negotiating at Harvard, because they all teach a way educated people would teach, where the FBI profiler's perspective is just to negotiate give the person what they want and keep everything else for yourself, right? Because a lot of times people from a utility point of view have this desire for just what they want, and they don't even think about other stuff they may want. And it's confusing for them in the argument. So, I'm wondering if you see a lot of that with just from gaming, just common sense people, they have a common sense way, which kind of surpasses what you're taught in education, where you become almost overeducated, unable to, remember, common sense things. Any thoughts?
I want to kind of follow up to what Marty has shared, because obviously I teach on the faculty at UC Berkeley, and this is absolutely something that we've been doing. And what Mark shared about universities starting to build relationships leveraging these platforms, absolutely spot on. Berkeley had its graduation in 2020 in response to COVID on Minecraft. So, we're starting to use these different platforms in creative ways to respond to current situation. And actually the Berkeley method of entrepreneurship, so I teach entrepreneurship over at the College of Engineering, and the branded Berkeley method of entrepreneurship is all about thinking about how to use games in a way to work with students who are otherwise find a harder time to be able to experiment. But having a game is just a safer way, where we're not talking about grades, the prospects of getting a job and all of that, and kind of letting people's guards down a little bit and having them actually explore a problem. And so I think the ability to gamify is so important. So I'll let you all answer Marty's question, but I just wanted to pitch in and add that in there.
Awesome.
Well, Bill, I see that you're unmuted. Did you have something to start with?
It's interesting that you're actually involved in it day to day. And because I want to throw it back at you a little bit with a question. I hate to do that, but one of the things I was expecting the universities to come out of COVID with a far more sophisticated gamification of learning. Like, my oldest daughter is 17, getting ready for SATs, and she's on Khan Academy. And I'm like, well, you'd think out of COVID, this larger presence would have come, or this combination of traditional learning and Khan. And so, is gamification going to close that gap, or is there this next element of digital technology that we need? And somebody mentioned AI, and I think my little model that I built for venture capitalists to do evaluate, I think AI one day is going to be able to predict valuations very accurately of these small companies. But is AI going to enter into it or anything? And sorry to go on a tangent, but.
No, not at all. That's such a great point. I'll respond to that briefly from kind of a university perspective, and love to get Marwan and Marvin and Mark's perspectives too. So from a university perspective, it's interesting you mentioned Khan Academy. So I sit on the board of an organization affiliated with Berkeley and Stanford, and Decode hosted CellCon for our first virtual conference, where he actually talked a lot about this wave of going digital. And what's been fascinating from a university perspective to see, particularly for a public university like UC Berkeley, is that there's a ton of approvals, for example, through Academic Senate for a lot of our courses. So the course that I'll be teaching next semester in the fall is themed around edtech. So covering everything from early childhood education, K-12 and tertiary, all the way up to upscaling and future of work. And thinking about how can components of gaming play a role in terms of better supporting, whether it's platforms, products, services, et cetera, for the use of learning and education. And so super relevant to what you just mentioned, because when we looked at some of the effective strategies that the university is coming out with, or in response to COVID with, some of the things that we've done is, number one, instant feedback loops. So at the end of every class, we have a survey that we ask all students to fill in, where we would, at the beginning of the next lecture, immediately address all of their feedback. So it's unlike previously where professors have lectures planned and you continue with the semester. This is much more co-designed learning. Two, we're also noticing that because, in the physical world, you have these shy students that come into class and they come in early, but they sit in the back of the classroom. And then you have these people who come in and make a beeline for the front row of the classroom. But in a virtual world, you just create more space for introverts, where if they arrive early, they're kind of by default at the front somewhat, that you have a conversation with them early on. And then later on, there's a room for breakout rooms. And we try to gamify components of that, where we say, if you provide course evaluations, you get points for that. If you do these things, you get points for that. So there's components that hopefully help better engage students in a way. And 3, we do this thing called video blogs, where at the end of every class, we have students that film a quick video blog about their experience. And it's very different than a previous in-person written world where they could be getting that information from other places. Whereas on video, you can just tell intrinsically whether or not that's their idea or if they're getting it from somewhere else, and if they're reading off a script. And you also get to hear about team dynamics, which you don't really get to hear about in the real world, because we've all had that experience where we're on some team project and there's this one person who's just cruising along, not doing anything. And then there's other one person who, oh, come on. But video blogs help you kind of expose those team dynamics in a way that previously we didn't have access to. So gamifying each of those components has been a really important part of education coming out, but we're still catching up a lot in terms of thinking about how to use these other platforms more effectively. Although I will say that I did lecture for an online pedagogy class that was available at Berkeley. I think the first one, my co-instructor, Christina Serrano, taught this class starting in 2016, where the entire class was taught on Zoom. And this is years before we knew COVID was going to happen. So in some ways, traditional education is still traditional, but there's been a lot of these creative classes that were available even at conservative institutions years ago. So hopefully we can better leverage those learnings going forward. But obviously love to hear your ideas for other platforms that we could be exploring for the upcoming semester, at least for the class centered around EdTech. So I'll stop there and not keep on going about my excitement on higher ed.
A small point, and then get Marvin in there. When I was very much involved with computer-based learning, both at a K-12 level and other levels. And I do a lot of consulting now with school districts and so on that are interested in how they can bring gaming into the education environment, and colleges, what courses they need to create in order to educate students that will have careers and jobs in the gaming world. One of the things I can tell you that was very interesting. I did a laptop school in an urban 98% free lunch school in Cleveland. We had 350 laptops. This was a number of years ago. One of the things that we observed was, and I think this is still an issue today, is that quite frankly, young kids are so much more sophisticated with technology than most of the teachers. And that is really intimidating to teachers. And it does slow the process down a bit because they are overwhelmed at times because the kids are accelerating. They're all moving at individual paces and they're not in control of that anymore. And quite frankly, don't have the level of sophistication with the broad base of technology that a lot of kids have today. And they're not as accustomed to multitasking across numerous applications. So that is a bit of a pushback, and will take some time as we bring in new younger teachers who are more sophisticated with technology, and the older ones retire. And until that happens, there's going to be some friction there, and that's just the way it is.
That's such a great point, Marvin, please.
I mean, the reason that the university system is so broken, as an Asian parent, I don't care if my daughter goes to university or not, because I just think they don't learn anything really practical. And my views on education in general. So it's just that old joke, right? Science progresses one funeral at a time. It's the same thing, right? So many of these old tenured professors who don't really understand sort of the technology and how to integrate it. That's a huge issue. And so I've invested a bunch of ed tech companies trying to get into universities. They get crushed all the time, right? If they, some younger professors usually want to adapt it, but they aren't allowed usually by the administration or for whatever reason, or IT or whatever. So this is why university is so backwards in this area. And my take is that, Stanford and Berkeley should be ahead of the game because they're in Silicon Valley. If they're not ahead, then shame on them, right? So let alone somewhere else, across the globe, but putting that aside, and so I just think I'm super excited by the things that are happening in the edtech space. So there's I took a class which I recommend. It's called Rite of Passage, WRITE, and they're one of the first of the cohort driven fully virtual, very content specific, right? So it's that's about writing, online writing. There's a lot of these classes are coming up now, and the way they integrate technology, not just using Zoom or whatever, but just the way they integrate technology to sort of build the community, or be on deck, or Lambda, there's a lot of interesting sort of areas are coming up from the outskirts that are really changing a lot of the game. And I don't know how this turned into an ed tech conversation, but just like I'm seeing a lot of innovation in that area that I think universities should be really, really terrified, because a lot of folks are like, well, I'm going to spend all this money, on going to a university when I really just want to learn this, right? And this is going to get me a job. And I'm seeing a lot of that right now, like very specific, like creator specific stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, Marvin, you're absolutely spot on. It's almost similar to some of the other trends we've seen in other industries where you can go onto, say, a bank's website and you can see how fintech is spinning out each of the different functions on that website. So it's almost like we're looking at kind of a traditional system of what used to exist in the old world that's now starting to be replaced by whether it's new ed tech companies or new gaming companies in kind of all of these elements. And so it's a matter of the traditional conversation we have in the corporate world where we say, it's either companies or traditional established players get to innovation first, or these new startups get to distribution first. So I think that's a great way of looking at not just education, but also gaming, social content, and all of that. So hopefully with that, we can bring the conversation back to gaming and podcasting.
I have a good segue for that back into podcasting, because it's one of the things that is so interesting. So podcasting, one of the big growth factors is obviously the fact that it's frictionless way to get to content. The other big growth factor is, the radio replacement. So NPR, everybody who listens to all the NPR shows on the radio, you now have that on demand on podcasts. So a lot of people came into that. So the traditional media companies who have taken their content that was on radio, figured out how to parse it up, put it on podcast properly, have gotten an audience. The ones that haven't have allowed tons of opportunity. And I'll give you a quick example. About a year and a half ago, it was January 26th, I had an idea to start a 1-minute daily podcast covering the coronavirus. Who knew? We basically, the World Health Organization, CDC, we set up a pipeline from them where they would just give us their posting on their website before, they'd email it to us, would read it. That was it. Within 2 months, it was the third most listened to daily news podcast on Apple. It was beating out every traditional news outlet except the New York Times Daily and NPR's up first. CNBC, CNN, all of them. We spent $11.95 besides the voice on this thing. No promotion, all organic traffic, people searching coronavirus. The other thing, if you asked Alexa, what's the coronavirus? It started playing the podcast. So we were getting tons of traffic. All the big media companies saw this. They then launched their own coronavirus podcasts, but their egos got in the way. And what I mean by that, they launched theirs and said CNN's coronavirus podcast with Dr. Sanjay Gupta, or BBC's coronavirus podcast. But when people were searching in Apple, they typed CORONA, and ours was titled Coronavirus 411. So it came up first. A couple months later, they all changed their titles to Coronavirus by CNN, Coronavirus by, but it changed. But, the opportunity will always be there if the big companies don't jump in these platforms with their content quickly. And the podcast still today does 30,000 downloads a day. We do absolutely nothing behind it. And these guys will ultimately have to buy it to get that traffic. So you either get in or you get clobbered by a little guy who has absolutely no experience in journalism.
So, Bill, what I'm hearing you say is also the fact that technology almost has an equalizer effect, and that the little guys can actually get in at relatively lower cost and be able to do something of high leverage. And given that, again, our panel's tasked to talk about the capital piece, I definitely have to ask you, because I saw a few questions in chat and some were DMs where people are asking about business models and monetization. So what are your thoughts on exciting new business models that are emerging in this space, given there's new technology? So if you're a little player with a lot of traffic, is the only way to get acquired, or are there other interesting opportunities? For example, Mark is talking about an IPO where you can tap into public markets. And Marvin obviously has done a lot of work with venture funds. So love to hear your thoughts.
I mean, one of the things I'd just say, if you're alternative media, I don't think venture capital is actually a very good vehicle for that. I think angel investing is very, very different. But for VCs, because of just the return profile and the growth, like we've just seen, like media has been a disaster for VC overall, right? Like it's complete disaster. I think it's different for an angel investor, right? Like because of just like you have a very different sort of risk reward profile. But for VC, you have to return money, and like just like it's a hit driven business, right? And so it's just, I think gaming and media are very, very hard for venture capital versus, say, for example, like software related things. Like that's just more in the wheelhouse. And I just see this over and over again. And so I think a lot of generalist VCs are going to take a hit. And if I think your family office trying to do this, like, I'm like, well, you got to be playing this game for a while and build a good portfolio, like an extensive portfolio. But it's just like, you got to be a lot more patient, right? These things just come out of nowhere. Like who the hell thought Flappy Bird would be anything? That was completely bootstrapped, right? It's just like weird things happen. But most of the gaming companies, it's a tough space for VCs in general. I wouldn't advise it. And I think alternative media, it's too fragmented. You need scale, right? Like, and so how many great returns have come out of podcasting right now? Unless you're a bootstrap business making money off the ads or subscriptions or whatever, I think like, except for those bunch of acquisitions that Spotify did, there are a bunch of like several multi-$100 million acquisitions. I haven't seen anything else since then. That was like 3 years ago.
Yeah, I just want to jump in there too, is that, one of the things that I spent a lot of years in the auto industry, and in an example of a retail auto dealership is it has a new car department, used cars, parts, service, body, and so on. These are all individual businesses that work collaboratively together. So as I have been building Esportz Network and Esportz Entertainment Corp, we have podcasting. We have the biggest news partner in the world. We have a talent agency with over 70 cosplayers in it. And so we will be in the education space at some point, because I have that background, and I think there's tremendous growth opportunity there. But when we merge with other companies, we'll be merging in with a lot of content creators, competitive teams, and site-based activities as well. So we're morphing into a different kind of media company. A lot of people kind of think of us as an ESPN of esports, where we're news and entertainment. And I think that is a stronger model. I don't think, and I agree with Marvin, that we're right for a bunch of VCs that have a different profile, what they're looking for. But family office have had some successful investments in this area, and angel investors absolutely have been very successful with the right model. Again, you have to look at these companies and make sure that there's revenue and meaningful revenue, and that they haven't loaded up with so much overhead that is fixed overhead cost. Even though human resources are somewhat variable, when you start getting into studios and other things like that, you have to have a certain amount of on the payroll talent. What we like about, for example, our 90+ reporters, they're all freelance. We built a full technology ecosystem where we can evaluate them, rate them, pitch them stories, they can pitch us stories, and we pay them, and we own the content. So there has to be a different models when you're doing this. And a typical media model where you have a lot of reporters on a payroll, that is broken. That does not work. So we started out day one with a whole new build using technology in order to have a better relationship and better quality across a broader segment of the world.
I think what I can hear is the biggest shift in terms of how we talk about gaming, even just from a few years ago, is that it has really become mainstream in a lot of other industries. For example, kind of how we evolved into an ed tech conversation is precisely because gaming has become so prevalent. And same thing in terms of thinking about how media platforms are built and in terms of thinking about business models. So curious to hear, as you're looking ahead to the next year, what are some of the most interesting things that you're seeing now that you think will form an important part of future trends within this gaming and content space? It could be related to other industries, whether it's education, finance, or how we do other things as well. But curious to hear things that you think are going to be most exciting looking ahead.
I'm going to jump in just real quick. And one of the things that I can tell you that I'm absolutely seeing, when we created our show, The Gamer Hour, which was a late night TV show model with a monologue and then an interview and then gameplay. We have now got over 1,000 athletes and entertainers who want to be on our program. We're working with over 20 agents. What I really see that's fascinating is the convergence of traditional sports, traditional entertainment, of all kinds of people who are, comedy, etc. There is a massive amount of people that are, living their main life, which is playing NFL football. But when they get out, when they're not playing NFL football, they're playing Fortnite or playing any number of games, and they're passionate about it. And so there's this convergence in music as well, huge convergence. Some of the biggest gamers are rappers and musicians. So we haven't yet even seen what the full potential of that emerging of all these different types of professions with gaming really can become. But that's exciting. And there's a lot of capital with those people to push some of the things that they're excited about.
Absolutely. Bill, did you want to jump in? Oh, Marvin, please.
Yeah, I'm just say, like, one of the things I'm watching very closely, right? So I assume everyone has either read the book or watched the movie, like Ready Player One. And so a lot of stuff I'm paying attention to is sort of this, we talked about it earlier, illusion, and just like media is all coming together, right? So especially young people who are like all, like, I think the on ramp to digital in general is gaming. And so you're seeing that where I think we're entering this world of metaverse. I'm watching like what Epic is doing, right? Their lawsuit against Apple, like everything they're doing is like building all the core pieces of this metaverse. I don't think it's be exactly like Ready Player One, but we're already spending most of our lives online anyways, digitally, right? And I think sort of that extension, especially as like VR, I was a big VR skeptic, but I see stuff that's happening right now where we are starting to get close to, I don't know if it's like 5 or 10 years, but we are starting to get to that world where, especially young people, they're like, man, maybe they're just not ever going to interact with real human beings, right? And then we're all going to be pseudo-anonymous. And I'm seeing a lot of the infrastructure actually being built around that. And that's, I don't know, exciting or scary, I don't know, but like that's the future, whether we like it or not.
And I'll just wrap it up by saying what Marvin said. I'm serious. It's, AI is going to be, it's already shown it can program content better than anything, TikTok. I'm now watching AI create content, and then you are in Marvin's world. And it is, I just heard a Rachel Maddow podcast that was not Rachel Maddow, and it was amazing. And I've seen David Beckham do an ad in 18 different languages perfectly, and it wasn't David Beckham. So it's here, and Marvin's world is among us. So get in it.
I know we have kind of a last 2 minutes left. So I would love to conclude with some specific or practical advice that you have, because we've really covered everything from your perspectives as investors, as founders at the forefront and operators, but also as just individuals, as parents who have kids who are now interacting with this world in such a different way, and seeing gaming bleed into education, bleed into other industries. So it would be great if each of you could leave some practical advice for what folks can then go on to do, whether it would be subscribing to a newsletter or following a podcast or checking out a particular platform. It would be great if you have some specific action steps for folks.
I'll jump in and say, first of all, as an older parent, you have to get past your fears of what your kids are doing. And if they're playing a shooter game, it doesn't mean they're going to go out and become active shooters. So I think, one piece of advice is try to learn a little bit more about their life, as opposed to seeing it as something you have no idea. Try to get involved a little bit and understand what they're actually doing, what they're playing, and talk to them about it. And I think that is something as a parent we always have a responsibility to. So I would say be early to the game to do that, not late to the game. And I think it'll be a better relationship. And also you'll be aware of anything if it's not going in the right direction as well. So piece of advice there. We also welcome people to listen to our podcast, Esportz Minute, which is every day, Monday through Friday, 2 minutes of the big stories, or Esportz Network podcast, the bigger deep dive with some of the most influential people in the industry. We're easy to find, Esportz Network podcast or the Minute, and we welcome you to our site, ESPORTZ Network, where a lot of news and other information is there, as well as our podcast. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. I certainly see younger parents now being even bigger gamers than their kids sometimes. So definitely facilitating better conversation there. Marvin or Bill?
I'll just finish it up by I very much agree with Mark. You know, I tend to put my capital what I see my kids doing, and understanding that this space is exactly what Mark like. This should be your high risk bucket, highly speculative bucket. But for the long term returns, your kids will guide you to where those businesses will be.
Yeah,
and that's it.
That is a tip. It's like, take a look at what your 10 to 12-year-old daughter is doing, sort of like in the sense of sort of like the apps that they're using, the games that they're playing, almost always as a precursor to sort of like mainstream adoption, almost always. Like I would say, if you take a look at the last media, gaming, whatever trends for consumer in the last like 10, 15 years, it started by young teenage girls.
Yep.
I love all of your advice. Super practical and easy for folks to track. So with that, thank you all so much for all the fun stories and advice and experiences you've shared, Mark, Bill, and Marvin. If you don't mind, afterwards, I see Marty's request that you kindly share your contact info or how people can connect with you in chat. With that, thank you all so much, and have a great rest of your day and take care.
Yeah. Thanks, Marty.
Thanks.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Marty.
Oh, and hopefully we're going to see you in person soon. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Shuo.
We're on games.
Thank you, Shuo.
We'll see you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.